All right, I'm going to get things started here. Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining. My name is Jeff Hulstrom. I'm the president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. We're a chapter of the National Audubon Society covering Franklin, Grand Isle, and Chittenden counties here in Vermont. We're very pleased to bring you another program by Jim Andrews. This time, he's presenting on native snake species. Jim's presentation is about ecology in the state of Vermont. And this is a place that has been sacred to indigenous people for thousands of years. The Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these lands and waters. We respect their connection to this region, and we remember the hardships that they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share this place and to work to protect it. And with that, I will pass it to our Master of Ceremonies, my fellow board member, Tom Gimicello.
Good evening, everybody. We're quite happy yet again this year to be able to arrange a presentation for you by Jim Andrews. I will read a little bit about Jim so that you learn about him. Then I'm going to talk a little about how we're going to handle the meeting tonight, and then I'll finally turn it over to him. Jim graduated from UVM and also has a master's in biology from Middlebury College. He's been working since 1990 as a full-time herpetologist and biologist in Vermont. He is a busy, busy man. Before you signed on, we were all comparing notes about the Christmas bird counts. Not only does he do that with his wife, but he currently is the chair of the Reptile and Amphibian Scientific Advisory Group to the Endangered Species Committee in Vermont. He coordinates the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, which is going to be what he would like to share our donations with. And he also is a research and teaching associate with the Family Forests in Bristol, as well as teaching institutions courses here and there. He also runs herpetological research and education projects and provides independent consulting. Now, this is what the guy has done. He's a founding member of the Salisbury Conservation Commission and has been compiler and organizer of the Middlebury Christmas bird count since its inception. He's also been working with the Vermont Agency of Transportation to help minimize the impacts of transportation infrastructure and traffic on wildlife. Conservation of Vermont's wildlife and wildlife habitat through education, field experience, and science is a common theme running through all of his activity. So you're gonna have a great experience here tonight with him. Before we start, I would like to announce that we are starting with this presentation. When we had our presentations in real time, we did something which was called Pass the Hat. And we asked for a donation from our attendees, and they were very generous. So in this digital world, our young 21-year-old communications chair has arranged to put a donation button on our website, which is greenmountainaudubon.org. We would ask that you consider helping us out. We recently, because we have bigger and bigger crowds for our presentations, we've upped our Zoom license up to 500, which has, we have incurred a cost to do that, and we're happy to do that. So we'd like to suggest a $2, a $5, or a $10 donation for this program. And as I said, we'll be splitting that 50-50 with Jim's charity, which in this case is the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, and we'll be getting that directly to him. For the program tonight, if you open up your chat on the bottom of your screen, that is where you're going to ask your questions. I will be your moderator. Jim has asked that he's going to stop his program halfway through and he's going to take questions. So any questions that you have from the beginning of the program, just type it into the chat and I will monitor that. Without any further ado, let us introduce our presenter tonight, Jim Andrews. Take it away, Jim.
Okay. Are we live?
We are.
All right, folks. Glad to see you. We're going to talk about all the snakes that we know of that are native in Vermont. And I want to start off here with this diagram. It's called a cladogram. And it shows relationships between different species. And if you look way over here in the lower right, you'll see snakes, other lizards, and amphibians. Now, this amphibian actually is a reptile that looks like a worm, but it has scales, so it's a reptile. And so these amphibians and skinks, like our 5-line skink, which is our one lizard in Vermont, and all our snakes are very closely related. And we'll think of this point as where the common ancestor was, going back in time. And so these guys all have the same common ancestor group. And they're all closely related, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, that that our 5-line skink is more closely related to our snakes than it is to other lizards like geckos or iguanas, that kind of thing. So this group includes snakes and lizards and amphibians that are all very closely related. So when we use the term lizard, we're actually talking about snake-like scaly creatures that most of them have 4 legs. They actually come from a few groups. They're not one monophyletic, closely related group. Lizard is a loose term. Now that when we realize that, really because of all the genetic work that's been done recently. But let's keep on going back in history. As we go up here, we're going back in history. And so we can go back to what we call the squamates, which includes, okay, all the lizards and snakes and amphibians and their common ancestor right there. We can work back and take in the tuatara, which is a lizard-looking creature from islands off New Zealand that actually has a 3rd light registering eye under the skin of its head, and it has other different structures. It's quite rare and quite unusual, but not really a lizard, although it looks like one. We keep on going back in time and we get to the common ancestor that was also the common ancestor of all these guys, but also the crocodilians, the crocodiles. And actually, if we go down this way, you'll see birds, which to some of you might be a surprise, and you'll see dinosaurs I stuck in here. So the birds are really descendants of the dinosaurs. There's some flying dinosaurs, but we haven't even made it back to what we call the reptilia now, the reptiles. So for some, it might be a surprise to learn that birds are now considered reptiles. I, as a herpetologist, have not adopted birds as one of my areas of study. A herpetologist studies the turtles, skips the birds, and could study any of these things. And so the terms you might hear nowadays are warm-blooded reptiles, which would be the birds, and the cold-blooded reptiles, which would be all the rest of them. So, you know, when you have a Christmas bird count, if you want, we can now start calling it the Christmas reptile count. You know, I think maybe we should move in that direction, though we would confuse everybody, because the only reptiles that we could find in the winter, of course, would be the warm-blooded ones, the birds. So I move on to this shot because I know that there are lots of people in any group that I'm out with in the field. There are a couple of people that are standing back a little bit. They're not in the immediate close group when we're playing with a snake, and they're keeping their distance. And we could tell, you know, who's afraid. And it's really important in these kind of learning situations that you don't push anybody beyond their comfort level. You got to convince them of that, and then usually given a little bit of time after, you know, the young lady in the group or somebody in the group is holding the snake, they're ready to touch the snake. And then with a little bit more time, they're ready. Well, they'll hold it if you stay close in case they lose their nerve. And then by the end of most of these field trips, we have people holding, at least tried holding the snake. So you can make a lot of headway with people if they trust that you're not going to push them beyond their comfort level, and that you're there to rescue them if they do reach their comfort level. But I show this picture of this reddish, it's actually a gray squirrel, but it's a reddish morph of a gray squirrel. And I show that one here because the point I want to make is that people can, I have people call me and they're worried about, this big black snake. This one right here is a rat snake. They're worried about these big black snakes in their yard and whether it's safe to have them around with the kids and all. But I don't believe I have ever gotten a call with those same concerns about this way more dangerous, fluffy critter on the right, the gray squirrel. There is no question that here in most of Vermont, that gray squirrel is way more of a risk to your kids and your dog and whoever than that snake is. And why do I say that? Well, I would never grab a gray squirrel and hand it to some young lady like this young lady in the photo. If I did that, the gray squirrel would be scratching and biting, and they have diseases that they could possibly pass along that come from rodents, things like hantavirus. Their teeth are way longer. The teeth on this rat snake might be 1 or 2 millimeters at most, whereas on that squirrel, they could put a hole right down through to your bone. So my point is that most reptiles, and snakes in particular, are actually amazingly tame and docile creatures. Just imagine picking up, just picture any mammal that you want and go out and grab it and hold it, a skunk, a raccoon, a porcupine. In any case, you're going to end up wounded. But that's not the case if you know how to handle a snake. And in most cases, even if you don't know how to handle a snake, with any snake under about 2 feet long, even if you got it really, really mad and it bit you, it could barely break your skin. And then with the larger snakes, yeah, they could break your skin, but big deal. I mean, it's certainly less of an issue than a rose bush or a blackberry patch or nettles. So I want to try to put these things into perspective, that really that what we have in Vermont, as long as it doesn't have a rattle on the tip of its tail, is perfectly safe for you to pick up and handle gently, and you don't have to worry about it. E.O. Wilson, the late E.O. Wilson, just recently passed away, thought that this might well be an example of evolved sociobiology, whereas that we evolved from creatures that spent a lot of time in the savanna, in the tropics, where there were indeed a fair amount of venomous snakes. And notice I'm saying venomous. I don't want to hear any of you guys say poisonous. Poison is something you eat, you put in your mouth. If it's a poisonous snake, that means you ate it and it made you sick. We're talking venomous here, something that can inject a venom into your blood. If it is not a venomous snake, then it's perfectly safe for you to pick up and handle. It's no big deal at all. We have only one venomous species in Vermont, in Western Rutland County. It has a rattle. So if the snake has a rattle, don't pick it up. If you live outside of Western Rutland County, you don't have to worry about it. On the other hand, if you go down to Guatemala, or if you're in the savannas of Africa, then you got to know what you're picking up. And there are certain species that you want to stay away from. And there are certain species which, in my opinion, cheat. And the cheaters, in my mind, are those that spit, like spitting cobras, where even if you don't pick them up, they could potentially spit some venom into your eye. So I want to start off with this one of our local snakes, and if I could see and hear you all, I'd be asking you, okay, what's this one? This is one you know, right? This is one you've seen around the house. You've seen it many times. You know what it is. It's got to be a garden snake. So first of all, I'm going to slap you for saying garden snake. There is no such thing as a garden snake. There are garter snakes, which are named after the garters that men used to wear to hold their socks up. Apparently, those garters must have been striped, and hence the garter snake got its name. But even if you said garter snake looking at this thing, I still might slap you because this is not a garter snake. This is a very similar looking thing called a ribbon snake. And here is the garter snake. And I'm reminding you up here, not garden or gardener, but garter. And I want you primarily, there are some differences on the rest of the body, but primarily look at the head. And that's where we're going to be able to tell this species apart. This guy, probably a female actually, has a dark green head and a yellow upper lip. And there's no dividing line between this dark green head and that yellow upper lip. And this is not a very clean break between the green and the yellow. So notice the head first. Now up top is our ribbon snake. Way different. Bottom, garter snake. Up top, the eastern ribbon snake, a reddish head, a bar in front of the eye, and then a dividing line, a black dividing line, nice and straight, not wiggly, and then a beautiful bright white lip. So just looking at that head, it's also a fairly small head with a big eye proportionately. And then this, although right here, this looks kind of black, it really is a very, very dark green. And I think this is part of the photo that just makes this look almost black. But hey, no dividing line. This is not clean here. It's not clean there. A garter snake has something that I call ear patches. These are not really ears, but there's a yellow area behind the eye, which is about where you might imagine it to have an ear. That not found on a ribbon snake. And then that yellowish lip compared to this beautiful bright white lip. So first thing to look for, look at the head of a snake. If it has these stripes and you think it might be a garter snake, look at the head. And then look for that bright white lip. That's the next thing you're going to notice. And then if you're close enough, the reddish color and that black for eastern ribbon snake. Now, here's some of our more recent maps. And you see on the right-hand side here that through the Atlas program, we have got documented records, photographs of garter snakes in every single town in Vermont with still, look at this, a couple exceptions where we still don't have photo documentation. That does not mean that the snakes aren't there. It's just that none of our citizen scientists have sent us a photo from those particular towns. If you happen to see well, actually, I took a trip down to Searsburg. A couple of us from that herpetologist took a trip down to Searsburg here, which way up on top of the mountains. It's a high elevation town. And trying to fill in some record, we didn't find a garter snake. They're there. We know they're there. We talked to the road commissioner who has seen garter snakes there, but we still need some pictures of some fairly common species. But still, this is a statewide species. It's well adapted to living in cold weather. Whereas look at the ribbon snake. We had historic records up here around Shelburne Pond, and we've been there a number of times and have not found it. I should mention that the ribbon snake is basically a water snake. It is always in or near water, and it feeds on amphibians. So it's going to be in or near water. We had some historic records further north, even up in Grand Isle County. But nowadays, we have records only coming from, again, this is the reptile hotspot of our state, Western Rutland County. This record had become historic. I think it was in the 30s or the 40s, maybe something like 38, maybe 48 was the last record that we'd had from Orwell in Addison County. And we picked up another record there just this summer. It was very exciting. The young lady, Kate Kelly, who was out in the field with me, found a ribbon snake here near a wetland in Pond Woods State Park. We also have a population or a couple populations in the lower Connecticut River Valley. So ribbon is a really rare snake. And get back to my point, I would just love to hear anytime anybody sees a ribbon snake. So double check your garter snakes, please, and see if they don't have that bright white lip. We should talk a little bit about some basic differences that help you tell snakes apart. This picture up here on the upper left here shows that in the center of these scales on a snake's back, there may be a keel, a raised ridge, just like the keel on the bottom of a canoe or a sailboat. And that makes the snake feel a little bit rough in your hands. By the way, anybody who's handled a snake can tell you they're not slimy. Slimy is fish. This is not fish. These creatures are dry. But if they're feeling rough, they probably have these keeled scales. But we have other snakes that are absolutely smooth. They feel like leather in your hands. And see, no keels here. And that's useful because those snakes up here in the Northeast, those snakes that have keeled scales give live birth. The babies are born live, not in an egg. And those snakes that have smooth scales lay eggs. We have one that's kind of in the middle, the rat snake, that has weakly keeled scales, and that one lays eggs. Now here's some eggs. These eggs are milk snake eggs, eastern milk snake eggs, and they're hard to find. And we spend a lot of time in the field, and we don't often turn up cover that has snake eggs under it. But snake eggs are going to be under some sort of cover. They're not just going to be out and exposed to the sun. They're going to be under something, but it's going to be under something that gets warm so that it can incubate the eggs. And it might be the bark on a dead tree, or it might be a rock or a piece of old aluminum or something. And that's going to keep those eggs, hopefully heat up the eggs and keep them warm so that they can incubate and then hatch. The milk snake lays a particular style of egg, which is called an adhesive egg. And so they actually stick together. So that's what you see here is this clump of eggs that are sticking together because they are adhesive eggs. And like I mentioned before, these are coming from a smooth scaled snake, because those are the ones that we have that lay the eggs. Here's the milk snake, which really I think is a really pretty snake. I've always enjoyed this snake. I've always been excited when I can find it and pick it up. It's so smooth, it's so pretty. When they're younger, that pattern is much brighter. As they get older, or if they're about to shed, it gets duller. But one of the things that you can look for on a milk snake is this Y right on the back of the head. Now, sometimes that's a little broken or a little distorted, but it looks like a white Y on the back of the head. This guy is the source of most of our rattlesnake records. If somebody tells you that they heard a snake rattling, or they're sure they saw a rattlesnake, and they were not in Western Rutland County, then it almost certainly was a milk snake. Why? Because milk snakes rattle. A number of other snakes will shake their tails. And I believe shaking the tail really evolved to get your attention away from their head. Because, they lose their head, they're dying. If they lose their tail, they can't regrow it, but they're going to survive. So I think shaking the tail is to draw attention to the tail. And then that gradually evolved into the actual rattle that rattlesnakes have. But if somebody hears a snake or sees a snake rattling at them, chances are it was a milk snake. 100% of the rattlesnake records that we were able to follow up on and actually get our hands on outside of Western Rutland County, 100% of them were milk snakes. And so this really confuses a lot of people. They will also coil, rattle their tails, and it might even strike from a distance, but it's way too far away to touch you. But it's all a bluff. You just move in there, you calmly pin them to the ground with your hand, gently pin them to the ground, scoop them up, let them move through your hand. Don't constrict their head, don't constrict their tail. Just let them move through your hands. They will calm down, and in short order, they'll just be climbing around on your hand as if you're a normal piece of rock substrate, and they won't pay any attention to you. They may pay attention to somebody that comes running over and scares them. That may make them nervous again, but you're just the substrate, and they're just moving as you move your hands to support them. Eastern milk snake, I like this particular picture because it shows that they use old buildings. That's not unusual for them to be in the walls of a barn or whatever, and they are a species that feeds on mammals. They're carnivorous, so that they will indeed eat small mammals, mice, that sort of thing. Here's the youngster. Notice how bright that pattern is. They're just really, really pretty snakes. Reddish brown blotches outlined in black. In this case, this white Y is a little bit broken up. I grew up calling this thing, and my mother really taught me this name, and it was a pretty common name back then, spotted adder. It's a misleading name in that that adders are a European venomous snake, and we don't have any adders, and these guys are not venomous. But I think some of our ancestors just threw that name at them and it stuck. I've heard a few people also use the term checkered adder. And with checkered, that's getting a little bit further away from reality in my mind, unless they're looking at the underside of the snake, because this might look a little bit more like a checkerboard. Now, I show you this underside of this particular creature to make another point as well, that the undersides of snakes have some really important field marks that can help you identify the snakes. That of course means that you got to be comfortable looking at the underside. Maybe you're going to have to pick it up and take a look at the underside. But do if you get a chance, do that, because it can show you some important identification characteristics. Another thing about milk snakes, eastern milk snakes, is that they are ophiophagous. Ophio means snake, phagus means eating. And so if you don't like snakes, you might want to have some milk snakes around because they eat the other snakes. And I'm just amazed when I see a picture like this. I mean, here, that garter snake that you're looking at that it's eating is alive. These snakes, this milk snake has no way of killing its prey. It can't constrict it to death, and it doesn't have venom, so it can't kill it that way. And its teeth are tiny, so it can't bite it to death. So what do snakes do? Well, they eat things alive, unless they're constrictors that could actually kill something like a Burmese python, or they're venomous and they could kill their prey like a timber rattlesnake could kill a chipmunk with its venom. Unless they have either of those two tools, they're going to eat their prey alive. And many of you have probably experienced that when maybe you saw a snake eating a toad or something and you felt sorry for the toad and you helped the toad escape and it ran away. I, at one point, was out with a group looking for, this lady had reported timber rattlesnake. We didn't believe it, but we were going to go check it out. And then, we found a milk snake, and I showed it to her, and I said, is this it? And she said, yeah, that's it. I said, well, this is a milk snake. And she said, oh, that's not it. That's not the one. And she was really sticking with her guns here, that she had to have timber rattlesnakes. Some people make their decision when it has to be first and don't want to be confused with the facts later. But we had at that site, we handled one of the milk snakes and it regurgitated, which is not unusual because they get nervous and they'll throw up. And so it regurgitated a garter snake. And I couldn't believe it. I measured the garter snake. A garter snake was longer than the milk snake that was eating it. You wonder, okay, how is that possible? How could the garter snake be longer? How could it fit it inside its body? Well, the thing is that when they put it inside their body, they can kink it. It'll be wider because it's all folded up, but it's all kinked down, so it's about half the length. And so it will fit inside their bodies. And that's the first time I'd ever seen that. I was amazed that it could actually eat a snake longer than it was. So here's a distribution, which is kind of a standard distribution for some of our egg-laying snakes. And I say that because as you go further north and east in Vermont, you have a shorter and shorter growing season. You have a shorter and shorter period of time in the summer for the eggs to mature and develop and hatch. And so a lot of our egg-laying snakes are limited into how high in the mountains they can get or how far up in the northeast they can get. One of my techniques when I'm out in doing field work is to approach that group of old guys or old girls that are hanging around in the diner in the morning and start talking with them, strike up a conversation. And, hey, have you ever seen this snake? You ever heard of a milk snake or a spotted adder? And they don't up there in the Northeast Kingdom. They haven't seen it. They don't have it. It's really pretty interesting. It's too cold, I believe, in the growing season. It's just too short. So it's not there, but this may change. With climate change, we may see some of these southern egg-laying species moving up into the mountains. These are mountain towns here, moving up into the mountains or moving further north and east. And in addition, we may see some of the more southern species south of us in Massachusetts gradually moving up into the Connecticut River Valley, and probably the Champlain Valley would be some of the first places where they would show up. So we may see some of those changes, and it kind of looks like that might already be happening with the milk snake and a couple other species. They may be moving up in elevation and further north. Just to kind of reinforce that point, if you look at these two maps and how similar they are, and then you look down here and see what they are. This one is milk snake distribution, and this one is a plant hardiness zones. And this is showing zones 4B to 5B up here. And look how well that lines up the growing season with the distribution of this snake. It's amazing to me. That match is just really impressive to me. And of course, as the climate changes, I think the distribution of snakes may well change with them. Let's do one more snake and then we'll stop for some questions. But I want to talk about this particular snake here, the red-bellied snake, because it's a live birth snake. And so it is better adapted to colder climates. Now, I didn't really talk about that, but if you give live birth, that means you're holding your baby inside your body until it's ready to move around on its own. And if you hold it inside your body and where you are gets cold, all you have to do is move into the next sunny patch and you can warm up the kids again. You can't do that with eggs. I mean, if you leave your eggs somewhere, that spot has to be consistently warm enough for those eggs to develop. Whereas if you give live birth, if it gets cold where you're sitting, you move into the sun. You find a warmer spot. So it's a better adaptation if you're living in the north. And it also is a better adaptation to be skinny. If you're an ectotherm, it's better to be skinny. Ectotherm, I use that term, cold-blooded, solar heated. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But if you're skinny, you can heat up quickly. And you just follow the sun around and warm up. And it is also small. This thing, red-bellied snake, most of the time we see it, it's under a foot long. A really big female might be 14 inches. They're quite small. And one of the field marks for them, when you can't see their red bellies, is these little subtle marks on their neck. 3 white diamonds, one in the middle and one on either side. Now they're variable in color, the background color. This one's looking tan, this one's looking almost charcoal. Sometimes we see some that are they're almost black, but still You can't see them really well here, but you can see one of the spots on the side, another spot in the middle, another on the other side. There's 3 light spots on the neck. But of course, this is the red-bellied snake. So if you were to catch it and turn it over, that bright red belly is a giveaway. This is probably the second most widespread snake in the state, next to garter snakes. But a lot of people have never seen it because it's small and it usually stays under cover. But you might turn it up under your wood pile or under some tarp maybe that you left on the garden or under some old junk out behind the shed. Just really a pretty little snake, which, by the way, specializes in eating snails and slugs. And now that invasive earthworms, I don't know if you're up on that, but none of our earthworms here in Vermont are native. They're all introduced. And so they have picked up the habit of eating worms as well. Here's the distribution map. It is a woodland snake. And so there are some places as you get out into the Champlain Valley where it's kind of hard to find those patches of woods, or there's a lot less of it and you have to work harder. So we're missing records from some towns, but pretty much statewide. The kind of place where I would look for this snake is one of our favorite pieces of habitat is a small woodland opening, such as a logging header. If logging headers are good old-fashioned messy logging headers that have a bunch of logs hanging around, and some of them have bark on them that you can peel off, and there's some old cookies, pieces of wood that have been sliced off out there. There's a bunch of branches, places to hide under, and there's lots of sun. Then that's a perfect piece of habitat for them. They can escape into the woods if they want, or they can come out into the sun and soak up some heat. So before we go on to this cool snake fact, do we have some questions that have already shown up in the chat box?
We actually don't have any particular question. We had one earlier and somebody wanted to know what snake it is, but you mentioned it was a milk snake, so you answered that. So yes, folks.
So Tom, this is Jeff. I actually have 3 questions that came directly to me for whatever reason, so I could pose them to you, Jim. The first one from Holly: what is the digestive system of a snake like, especially if they can eat a snake longer than they are?
Well, it's a pretty thorough digestive system, and lots of acid there, and if their waste, a snake's waste is like a bird's waste. The solid waste and the liquid waste are combined in this kind of a white pasty mess that looks a little bit like bird poop. And as a matter of fact, let me digress just a little bit. I had one lady who had a handmade house, and the walls were all, the ceilings were all insulated with sawdust, and it was her office. She was a lawyer, and she practiced out of that office, and she told me that it smelled like snake poop in there, and I couldn't believe that. I'd never heard of anybody really having enough snake poop around to smell it. And we checked it out though, and she had quite a number of rat snakes, 5 and 6 foot snakes that were living in her walls and in the sawdust of her attic. She actually let me take down one of the ceiling panels and crawl around up in there. And she moved out of the office because it stunk. But I digress. That house really did have, there were big snakes and there were big clumps of poop, and it really did smell a little bit in there. I felt a little sorry for her, which is unusual for me, for somebody who has a thing with snakes. But in terms of digestive system, it's a stomach not unlike ours that pumps out a fair amount of acid. It's long and thin though, and that's really the arrangement of most organs in a snake, is to make them longer and thinner rather than short and round, so that it extends a long ways down the body. And that and their ability to compact their prey as they're eating it is what allows them to take in such a large object. The other things that are going on for a snake is that our ribs are joined here at our sternum, and they're all attached in the middle, but a snake's ribs don't do that. They come around, but they don't attach in the middle. Why? So that their ribs can expand, their body can stretch, and the ribs can go out like this, and so that they can eat something that has a diameter that might be 3 or 4 times their diameter. They couldn't do that if the ribs were all connected in the middle. This allows them to expand. The skin just stretches really widely. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute.
Great, thanks. Can you describe, this is from CW, can you talk about the best way to pick up and handle a snake here in Vermont?
Yeah, so as long as your snake doesn't have a rattle on it and you're outside of Western Rutland County, I encourage people to grab first and think later. If you think about it too much, that snake's going to be gone. So it's really not a grab, though. It's just a pin. You're trying to pin the snake to the ground. Gently pin it in place. Don't worry about whether it's the head or the tail or any of that. Just pin it in place. And then instead of grabbing it by the neck or the tail or wherever and holding it up, in which case the snake is going to get really nervous, just as you know, our host would. If I picked you up by your neck or by your feet and dangled you, you'd be uncomfortable. You know, you pin it, then you scoop it, and then it's going to be nervous for a while. It's going to move. So you're just moving your hands until it's gone far enough. And then it calms down. And if it starts to move again, you're not restricting its movement. And if you do it just gently. And then you let it move, it'll calm down quickly. It won't look at you as a threat anymore. It may get scared again as somebody else approaches quickly, but then you just have to calm it down again.
Next question from Holly. How does live birth happen? How many babies come out? And do they come out one at a time, or is it a mass exodus?
The number is, it's interesting because, you know, unlike mammals, unlike us, the size of the mother determines the number of babies that it can have, or in the case of a turtle, the size of the mother and the number of eggs it can lay. And so the bigger ones can have more kids. And so if it's a really, really huge snake, well, let's say the largest garter snake, I'd say it'd be a little over 3 feet long, maybe 38, 39 inches. It could have something like 50 young individuals coming out one at a time. What was the second part of the question? Did I answer that already?
So yeah, do they come out one at a time, or is it a mass exodus?
Yeah, it's one at a time. And with the exception of the timber rattlesnake, they don't take care of the kids at all. Once they are birthed, they're on their own. The timber rattlesnake, doesn't this warm your heart and just make you want to go see a timber rattlesnake? Mm-hmm. They actually have some mothering instincts, and they take care of those kids until they shed for the first time. And then once they've shed for the first time, now that may only be 10 days, 2 weeks, but until they shed, they take care of them. And it's really cool to see mama and the kids moving together. The kids' bodies are actually touching mama's body, and they're moving almost as one creature, but they're all moving independently, with the little snakes maybe moving over the back and under the belly and all, but they're always in contact. At least the ones I've seen, they try to stay in contact with the mother's body as they move along. I remember being out with a warden one time and a couple other people. Well, one of the people was Steve Perrin, who's a recently retired biologist in the state. And we were looking for rattlesnakes, and one of them rattled and started heading up the slope. No, and heading down the slope. And I remember the game warden just took off up the hill. It's interesting because there is almost a subliminal reaction to the sound of the rattle that quickly triggers a reaction. But it's funny how training could change that, because he was running in the other direction and both Steve and I were running after it. So we were going downhill. Mama was going down with the kids and she hid under a rock. And I remember going down there with the cameras and we were peering under the rock and Mama was looking at us. And rattlesnakes are a visual predator. And so it's unlike a garter snake. When they look at you, your eyes meet. And you know you're looking at another living creature and it's looking at you and thinking, and you're looking at it and thinking, and it was as if it was saying, okay, guys, what's your next move? What are you going to try to do now? Do we have some more questions, sir?
We have two more. One's a quick one. How did you know from the photo of the garter snake that it was a female?
Oh, I was going on the size. I was going on the size. I mean, the females being the ones that have the kids, they get bigger. And in a gravid, which is the word we use for pregnant for snakes, if they're gravid, they look even bigger and they're filled with eggs and they look full. They look a little heavier bodied. I don't know that's the case with that snake, but that was just a guess that I took because it was kind of chunky.
Okay.
I thought maybe it was a gravid female.
Great, thanks. And then our last question. Did the eastern diamondback exist in a more widespread area in Vermont prior to human development?
Okay, well, we never had the diamondback. The diamondback is a much bigger rattlesnake, and it lives in the southeastern part of the country. So Texas, Florida, I don't remember exactly how far north, but up a couple states, Georgia, up into there. It's a whole different creature, and it's not anywhere near as docile. It's quite a bit bigger. But to answer what I assume is the point of your question, the timber rattlesnake, our snake, the timber rattlesnake, definitely was more widespread. And if you could see at the map that I showed you a while ago, it apparently worked its way up the Connecticut River Valley, at least halfway up the state, and within written history. And then it worked its way up the Champlain Valley, at least as far as Milton, where there was a snake. It's now Arrowhead Mountain. Used to be called, I think, Snake Mountain or Rattlesnake Mountain, something like that. So it definitely worked its way much further north. And there were bounties on it until 1971. You could get a bounty if you brought in a timber rattlesnake to the local town clerk. I think it was just $1 a piece. And there's stories, there are interesting stories about that. I talked to some of those bounty collectors, and after they took the snakes to the West Haven town clerk, then they say, well, what do you want me to do with the snakes? And I said, I'll just go throw them out. And then they take them over to New York State and get a bounty there.
Work in the system. And that's the last question. And Abby and Charlie corrected themselves that it was, in fact, a timber rattler that they were asking about. So thanks for answering the questions. And that's all we have. Thanks. Okay,
let's continue. So here's my cool snake fact number 1. So about it, and this lines up with the eating questions. So first of all, look at the amount of stretch right here. These black scales were all side by side before this rat snake ate this baby rabbit. But see how much they have stretched out, and they can do that because the ribs on the bottom side don't connect. So that skin can stretch and that body can get 3 or 4 times the diameter more than what it used to be. And then what's the other trick? The other trick is this stuff. Now, first of all, look at the nasty teeth on this snake. This is not any of our snakes. This is a Burmese python, and it feeds entirely differently. It gets big prey. It needs to have big teeth. So don't let these guys scare you. Once again, the teeth on our snakes are so short that you can barely see them, like a millimeter or 2. Tiny, tiny, tiny. But look at this. The lower jaw is called the mandible. And in a snake, there's no connection here in the middle. In the middle of my chin, that's all bone. It's all connected. So just like the ribs of a snake that are not connected, the lower jaw is not connected. So it can take in a huge piece of food. and it can spread that lower jaw. Just think of my like my arms here. They can spread it out like that and out like that, and take in a piece of prey that is much larger than the diameter of their head. And so that's called mandibular liberation. And I just love that phrase. And I would like to see it on a t-shirt sometime. Support mandibular liberation. The mandibles are liberated. They're not connected in the middle. The only thing that's in between here is skin, and that skin can stretch just like it's stretching here. The scales can come apart and the skin stretches out. And you see what you're looking at here is all the skin between those scales. But in addition, snakes have cranial kinesis. Cranial, cranium, right? The top part of the skull. Kinesis means they can move pieces of their skull. It's not all connected. It's not all hard welded together. So this part can separate, it can twist, it can go backwards and forwards a little bit. Look at how it's showing the direction of movement. So when a snake gets something in its mouth, it can reach out with one part of its lower jaw, grab it, pull it in, reach out with the other part, grab it, the top part, pull it, and they do that one side or the other. You'll see that if you watch a snake eating a frog or eating its prey, you'll see those different parts of the jaw move independently and pull the prey into their body, which is just really something to watch. So I love those two terms, cranial kinesis, impress your friends, and mandibular liberation. So here we're looking at a Decay's brown snake, which is another live bearing little snake, but instead of this being kind of an upland woodland snake, this one's really the valley snake. This likes wet fields, overgrown wet fields like the Champlain Basin, like the Connecticut River Valley, like the Winooski River Valley, swamps and wet fields, but it also likes to move into woodlands, rocky woodlands, where it can spend the winter, and then it goes down into those wetland edges and overgrown fields to feed again on slugs and snails and earthworms, named after a famous old naturalist, Decay. Decay's brown snake. What we're looking for here is some subtle markings on the head. And these black markings are what we're looking for. It doesn't, like a red-bellied snake, it does not have the red-bellied snake's diamonds in the middle on either side. It has this black patch here. It has black under the eye. It has black that comes down here, which I refer to as the sideburns, vertical marks right there. And it has these little black patches on the back of the neck. And all that stuff is real useful. If you think it looks like a red-bellied snake, well, it does. But if you were to turn it over, it doesn't have a red belly. It just has this opaque, creamy, maybe light tan sort of belly. And here we get the markings again. Black under the eye, black patch on top of the head, black sideburns, little black here. I refer to them as parentheses. And usually these black squares, now I don't know if that showed up really well. When they stretch out, and this is the case with many snakes, when they stretch out because they have a big meal in them, their pattern changes. And when these guys stretch out, I should also say it's not necessarily just a big meal. It might be that they're afraid and they're puffing up and they're trying to look scarier. They're trying to look bigger. And their pattern may change when they do that. And this guy has a checkerboard pattern. It doesn't really show up very well here, alternating squares that may show up on the sides. We see some of it here, but that checkerboard pattern and these black head markings, Decay's brown snake. One thing is kind of interesting. Now, this is a baby, live birth, just born. I found this when I was out running one day, and Mama had been, roads are a big problem for snakes. And Mama had been basking in the road and was run over. And the kids were squeezed out of her body, just like toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. They had been squeezed out. And I picked up one of them and brought him home to take some pictures of, just to show you the size. But notice that it still has these markings on its head. It has the black patch, it has the black under the eye, it has the black sideburns, it has the black parentheses back there. But the youngsters fill in all the empty spaces with this white, which is really pretty interesting. It can confuse people. They might think it must be a ringneck snake, because I've heard that name before, and it certainly has a ring around its neck. But no, it's a little decayed brown snake, and it'll lose that pattern as it ages. But it's not unusual that snakes can change their pattern either as they age or as they puff up. Now, like I was telling you before, this really is a Champlain Basin snake. Look at this. I mean, there's a spot at the south end of Snake Mountain where I like to go to see the snakes as they're moving uphill in the fall after the first frost, to see them moving up to their denning sites. And if I walk back and forth on this short section of sunny south facing hillside country road, I should be able to find 10, 20, 30 little decayed brown snakes moving up out of the wetlands and into the rocky uplands. So definitely Champlain Basin snake, lowland, wetlands, other scattered records working their way up the Connecticut River Valley here and up some other river valleys a little bit further north, but not known, excuse me, from higher elevations or the Northeast Kingdom. Here's a pretty snake that you really just can't confuse with anything. If it's solid green and smooth, it's a smooth green snake. And this is always really exciting to find. Not easy to see because it blends in so well with the grasslands and shrublands that it feeds in. It is insectivorous, which means as far as we know, it eats only insects, grasshoppers and crickets and stuff that are living in the grasslands. Its conservation issue is the whole idea of how we keep grasslands open. Its conservation issue is mowing machines. So where can it live without running into a lawnmower or an agricultural machine that, it's cutting crops? Well, it could be a wet portion of a field maybe that doesn't get cut regularly, or it could be a power line. Now, power lines are ugly things, and people don't much like power lines going through their territory, but they create habitat for a variety of species, including snakes, because they need to be kept open, and there's lots of grassy patches in there. And let's see, areas that are cut with a, cut with a brush hog that only get cut occasionally, but not regularly, or pastures that are not heavily grazed can also be good pieces of habitat. So, thanks. So they like open grassy areas. We have found them under power lines, and usually they like to have rocks around as well, but a very gentle snake. I don't believe we've ever caught one that even tried to bite. One thing I want you to know about snakes is that the color that they reflect, that you see on them, may change when they die. So the green that we're seeing in this snake is because it's reflecting both blue and yellow light, and it's reflecting the yellow light as a result of some oils that are in its skin. And when it dies, those break down and they no longer reflect yellow, and so they start turning blue. And if they've been dead for a while, they will look solid aqua blue. And you'll see the same sort of thing in other species that had greenish colors on them, in particular garter snakes. That if they had some greenish areas, when they die, that yellow pigment's going to break down and they're going to start look bluish. This guy on the lower right is probably just about ready to shed because it's just looking a little darker, but still Beautiful smooth green snake. Notice that this behavior, which is not unusual for some snakes, to hide their head, to protect their head. They're tucking their head in under their body. It's a smooth snake. So like we talked about before, lays eggs. Here's a little one just breaking its way out of its egg and ready to enter the world and take care of itself. Mama's not going to help him unless he's a rattlesnake. Here's a little piece of their habitat. In this case, it's just kind of along the fence line. See all the grasses here. There's some rocks, combination of grasses and rocks. Weirdly, even though the snake lays eggs, we do find it at some higher elevations. And I think that's because of an adaptation, which is egg retention, that they do lay eggs, but they keep the eggs in their body for a long time, so that most of the incubation of the eggs actually takes place inside their body, and they're moving around from sunny spot to sunny spot and keeping those eggs warm. And by the time they actually lay those eggs, they're 3/4 developed already. So they don't need as long an incubation period outside the body. Here's the same sort of egg-laying snake pattern of distribution, missing from the Northeast Kingdom, but it is included in some mountain towns down here. Apparently missing from much of the Lake Champlain Valley. You know, this might be a second to mention these numbers you're looking at. S stands for state. 3 is a ranking system. The ranking system goes from 1 to 5. 5 are the most common species. 1 are the rarest species. So a 3 is in the middle. Garter snake would be a 5. Ribbon snake would be a 1 or a 2. Medium priority is their species of greatest conservation need, and they have been ranked in terms of what the conservation need is: high, medium, and low priority. And this is medium priority. This is a really pretty snake, the ring-necked snake. But despite the fact that it's beautiful and harmless, it is a good snake to use as an example to start talking about musk, which is really one of the defenses that snakes have that we haven't talked about. Not so much the teeth, but the musk. That were you to handle the snake and it becomes nervous or anxious, it may defecate on you. And that's just not the mixture of solid and liquid waste that we're talking about. It may well be mixed with musk that stinks. And this guy, for being a very, very pretty snake, also has a very stinky musk. And I wonder if this bright yellow color, the bright yellow of the underside, might warn of its particularly smelly state. I'm not sure. Also, I'll bring up something here, and I don't want to scare you with this, but this is a mildly venomous snake. I mean, I handle them all the time, but when we use the term venomous, we use it relative to amount of venom that could really affect a human or be injected in a human. These guys have small fangs in the back of their mouth, so that if they actually eat something and it goes down their throat, they can chew that venom into, let's say, a salamander, which is one of their main prey. And they could chew that venom in there, which anesthetizes the salamander and makes it much easier to swallow and get it down his throat. I've never heard or never had any personal experiences with them being able to envenomate a human. I think you really have to stick your little finger down their throat in order to make that happen. And I trust that none of you are really going to try to do that. So this yellow coloration might be potentially advertising that, but it's interesting they don't have that bright yellow. Beautiful snake. Ring around its neck. It's a different ring than what you saw in that young decay snake. Black border on either side. Beautiful gunmetal gray here. And usually yellow or orange on the underside. It's an egg layer, but I think, again, must be one that really retains its eggs, because it has been able, at least in the lower elevations, to survive well north and up into some higher elevation points. This little group that you see here, it's really typical, because these are all really high mountain towns that are almost entirely forested, and really, for being in the south part of the state, colder than much of the state, particularly at that latitude. So here's a really cool snake, common water snake. I should mention that like we saw in the DeKay's brown snake, that many snakes, when they're smaller, actually have a more obvious pattern. And a little water snake has what I call saddles. These are not blotches. I would call it a blotch if it ended somewhere on the back, and then this was clear down here. This was background color. These are what I call saddles. And with water snakes, they usually have saddles on part of their body, like here, and then those saddles break up. They become distorted and become alternating blotches on another part of their body. And as they age, they become darker and darker, so that the adults might look totally black. Here's a really pretty colorful one here. It shows that really a chunky snake. In terms of having a body, a heavy body, there's only two snakes that are that chunky: timber rattlesnake and this water snake. But the underside is really beautiful. It's smooth, and it's these half circles all pointing toward the tail, that if in many cases they remind you of granite countertops that people spend lots of money on. It's really a pretty pattern, and it's very unique to the species. Notice the different shape of its head. If we were compared head shapes to say cars, this is a minivan right here, as opposed to a Lamborghini or a sports car. This is high-sided, vertical sides, apparently particularly good for catching fish. Champlain Basin, lowland water snake. Places in particular where there's rock that comes right down next to the swampy edges of a lake. Shelburne Pond is one of the famous places for this. If you wanted to see one, Shelburne Pond or Bristol Pond. But until just recently in the Connecticut River Valley, we only found them in Vernon, and we had some historic records from Brattleboro. But just over the last couple of years, we picked up new records for this town and this town. And this is one of those where I can't help but wonder, are they moving their way up the Connecticut River Valley now that we have a warmer climate? I don't know. Did we just miss these guys before? Possible, but I'm real interested. Just over the last couple of years, this snake has shown up further north than where we were able to find it before. Let's see. I should mention here, for those people who are nervous about snakes, this is not your starter snake. Snakes have different dispositions, different species. And, I mentioned the smooth green snake, very, very docile. The big black rat snake, or more correctly, the eastern rat snake, very docile snake. But water snakes, they're nervous. They're high strung. And you probably will get bit if you try to handle this snake in a way that I told you to try to calm it down. It will probably bite you once before it calms down. Now, from my perspective, that's a good thing, because then you get an idea of what a bite is really about, and you realize that's what I was worried about. What's the big deal? I mean, Roses are worse. You know, when you're mowing the lawn, you go by the rose bush, and I put that bush there on purpose. It may bleed a little bit and it may itch a little bit, but that'll be done in a couple minutes. It's really not a big deal, but they are more nervous than other snake species. Cool snake fact number 2. So how do these squamates, snakes and lizards, how do they reproduce? How do they put sperm into the female snake's body? Well, mammals, as you know, you got one organ, penis, to put sperm into the female's body. But snakes have hemipenes. They have 2. And they're usually tucked into the base of the tail, here where my thumb is. They're usually tucked in, and they're inside out. And when they're ready to reproduce, they're moved out. And as you can see, this one is still tucked in at the end. It hasn't fully extended. Think of them as like the pockets in your pants. And you reach down into those pockets, grab the bottom of the pockets, and pull them out. And that's what's going on here. They were tucked into the tail, and they're going to be pushed out, and they're going to be hollow on the inside. And they'll have these barbs on the outside, and the barbs hold them in place. So if you're doing some sort of mating trick like this, you might want to have your hemipene held in place. 2 milk snakes dangling from the entryway to the cellar of this house in Benson. They use only one at a time to mate with. Hemipenes. Snakes and lizards have hollow hemipenes tucked in the base of their tail. And that's also one way that you can try to tell a male from a female. This part of the tail in a male has to have room for the hemipenes. So it cannot taper. It's usually parallel sided, whereas in a female, you can see a taper within the first 7 or 8 scale rows. Here are a couple of mating water snakes. And look at what this guy had for a meal, or this lady. Something big. Bullfrog maybe. Really stretched out this section. Remember, the ribs don't connect in the bottom, so it's just, it can stretch out, and that meal might last it for a week or so. And here's the male. It's smaller. It doesn't have to carry the young. It just needs to deliver the sperm. Wraps its tail around the underside. One of its hemipenes might well be everted and put into the cloaca right here to deliver the sperm. We have a video, I believe it's available online at our YouTube station, of a big rat snake that has a garter snake trying to mate with it. I had never seen anything like that. The garter snake is, you know, 1/4 the length of the rat snake. And why it would even have tried to mate with that big rat snake, it certainly couldn't be successful in producing any young, but it was a pretty interesting thing to see. All right, now, if it has a rattle, and I don't mean if it rattles, because there's lots of snakes that could rattle. I've had racers rattle at me, and when they did, I stopped, I backed up, I double checked, is that really a racer that I'm going to pick up? Because they can be very convincing in the noises that they make. But here, if you actually see the rattle, the segmented rattle, you know, kind of a yellow tan color, black tail. Timber rattlesnakes have a black tail, and there's good contrast between that and the rattle. They're a heavy-bodied snake. They're heavily keeled. You can see the keels here. They're divided into 2 color morphs, dark heads, black-headed ones, black face, yellow heads. And here you can see that it's a pit viper. This is the area where it can pick up radiation, and it can read heat, infrared. It can read heat like we see light. So their prey is warm-blooded, and so they can see their warm-blooded prey, and They can strike, inject their venom, pull back. Chipmunk can run away, go die, and then they follow it and then eat it. And they don't have to worry about a mammal that's a little bit larger that could have done damage to their eyes or their face because they've already anesthetized it or killed it, and then they could pick it up later. Cool snakes. I mean, I could talk a long time about just this one species, but I won't. I mean, it's the black dots mean, I mean, we actually have photographic documentation that is not historic. And look, Western Rutland County, very confined to this particular area. We have historic records here that you see going as far north. Here's the Milton one. Coming up through Springfield, up into Windsor County a little bit. And there's some historic denning areas just across the lake here. So most of these snakes were coming from a denning area across the lake. And we had our own denning area in Springfield, but that particular one, I believe, is gone now. Timber rattlesnakes den together. They're communal denners, and they'll travel a couple miles to one den. So once people figured out where their dens were, they could go to those dens in the spring and fall and wipe out a whole population. And so they were particularly susceptible to that kind of hunting pressure from humans, and also to the spread of disease. Because they're denning together in just a handful of dens, if they get some disease in that den, then it can have a real negative impact. And New Hampshire's had real trouble with this. They have one den left, really high percentage of this particular disease that is within that den. And we have some snakes that have this new disease that we're concerned about. I mean, it doesn't really appear yet to be affecting our populations. I mean, it's a nasty looking fungus that's growing on the skin and disfiguring the faces of some of these snakes. Snake fungal disease, SFD. Here's a couple of the bigger snakes. This is a rat snake. I mean, most of us in Vermont are used to snakes that are under 2 feet long. We're not used to seeing something that's over 6 feet. But the eastern rat snake can be over 6 feet. It is just big. Here's one crossing the road. Like most of our black snakes, if they look all black when they're adults, they had some more colorful pattern when they were younger. This can look a bit like a milk snake with these blotches on the back. But notice that these blotches have kind of squared corners, or the corners are sticking out, maybe like the letter H, or like a flying squirrel that's gliding. They stick out on these four corners, or like they were drawn in with an Etch-a-Sketch. Those people who are old enough to have ever played with an Etch-a-Sketch, real irregular corners. That's typical of a young rat snake. And as is this line right here behind the eye. Here's one that was reddish color, more like a milk snake, but still notice those corners on those blotches. But as they mature, they get darker and darker, and you can barely see any trace of the pattern. But remember that as they get stretched out, their bodies can stretch, they're going to show the skin. And in this case, the skin is white. And so you see speckled white marks on rat snakes. You don't see that on racers, which is our other great big black snake. You see these speckled white marks. And the other thing is, this is an arboreal snake. How a snake can climb up a tree, even if it doesn't have branches, it's just an amazing thing. I had actually caught this snake, put it at the bottom of the tree, and then watched it as it climbed up. And it was poking its head in these woodpecker holes until it found one where it could get into the center of the tree. And then it went up the center of the tree and it came out another woodpecker hole further up. They feed in there. They feed on the eggs and the fledglings of birds that are in those places. And also, we have created artificial trees. And our artificial trees essentially are barns and sheds and things like that, where birds and mice also like to lay their eggs and have nests. And so they love to move into an old barn or an old shed that has cover. They can climb around in there. They can get up in the attic and they can feed on the eggs. They love eggs, even chicken eggs. and fledglings. Very limited distribution. Look at this. Once again, there's Western Rutland County. And then we have another population up here, which is in the Moncton, New Haven, Bristol boundary area. It's actually smaller than it looks like. It doesn't cover all three, the entirety of all three of those towns. We've got these scattered other records, and I put T down there, likely transported by humans. I think that these are released individuals, and we had no evidence of a real population in those places. That happens. People move things around. People may have taken them in for a pet for a while and then let them go somewhere. This being such a docile snake is it's protected, but they could have had illegal pets. Here's the other big black snake that we have. Again, could be over 6 feet. But solid black. It's not going to show any white specks in it. And look what I refer to as that Darth Vader helmet on this thing. It has a very different looking head with strong eyebrows. Very, very strong eyebrows that show up when you're looking at it. It's a diurnal predator, moves during the day, hunts by sight. It's another, not a beginner snake. It's nervous, anxious, and will try to defend itself. It won't attack, but if you catch it, it will try to defend itself. This is a picture of what herpetologists look like. We're a scraggly bunch. Actually, these guys are some local naturalists. You may recognize some of them actually from the southern part of the state that were helping me with this study where we had radio transmitters in a few of these racers so we could learn about their population. One of the issues racers run into is this far north, they need open areas to get the sun that they need. And so those open areas are, they also like to travel. They're very active and they may cover a few miles, 2 or 3 miles in a couple weeks. So try to imagine a stretch of open area that is 2 or 3 miles long that doesn't cross a road or an agricultural field or someplace where they might get hurt. And so that's one of the issues that they're up against here is we have fragmented the habitat so much and put roads in so many places that these guys have a hard time finding habitat that's big enough for them to survive. And in this case, they were using a power line. Okay, that makes sense, right? A long, thin piece of power line where they could travel, but they also hit the edge of Interstate 89 and they traveled along the edge of Interstate 89. They seem to be pretty good about staying out of the road. One of them, I think one of them might have actually been hit in the road. Another one was hit in a log road during our study. We haven't seen any rat snakes and racers, North American racers. We haven't seen any North American racers or received any new reports of North American racers in a few years now. So we're very concerned about this species. It is protected. It is listed as a threatened species, but we're concerned, at the rate that we fragment habitat, whether or not it's going to be able to survive here. Here's a baby racer. Again, it doesn't look anything like the adult racers. It could look a little bit like a milk snake, but notice it has a solid copper colored tail. That's a good field mark. I've never seen a baby racer, by the way, in Vermont. Here's the distribution that they used to have. And most recently, just further down here in the corner, all the way to the Vernon Guilford corner. But these are historic records, and I fear that most of these are going to become historic in the future. Cool snake fact number 3, we ought to mention, if you're an ectotherm, cold-blooded is the term people use. Cold is misleading because their blood in the summer is going to be 80-something degrees. But the thing that you should keep in mind is that it's solar heated, so they're way more efficient than we are. They don't need to eat a lot of food to generate a lot of heat to keep their bodies hot. So like during the day, they may use 1/7 to 1/10 of the amount of energy, say, that this flying squirrel does, something about the same size and mass. Way more efficient. They don't need nearly as much food. And then at nighttime, this flying squirrel is going to have to keep his body temperature up, but the snake doesn't even try. Its body temperature is going to come down. It's going to become inactive. And then as it warms up the next day, it's going to become active again. So it's way more efficient. It's like turning the thermostat down at night, whereas this guy can't turn his thermostat down. So when you put all that together over the course of a few days, our snake uses only about 3% of the energy that a mammal would of the same size. Here's one of our big black snakes, the racer. No white specks, solid kind of gray white belly. Here's another of our big black snakes, the rat snake. It has an interesting pattern on the other side, underside. It's white here, checkerboard here, and then toward the tail is black. Rat snake face on the left, racer, look at that eyebrow. On the right. Here is a snake that's only shown up a few times, 4 or 5 records. Is it moving north into Vermont? Has it always been here in sandy habitat, but we just didn't know it? It's a hognose snake. We haven't really called it a native snake yet, but it probably is. We get a couple records from Vernon right down south on the Mass border, but pretty easy to recognize with that snout, that upturned snout. Hognose snake is the one that plays dead, turns over, rolls over, plays dead. You flip it right side up, it'll turn back upside down, so you make sure to think that you'll think it's dead. Eats toads, likes sandy habitat. Got to keep our eyes open for this tremendously variable pattern. Could be solid black, could be patterned like this, but look at that rostral scale, quite different. That's all the snakes. One thing that's kind of fun to do and that we do to monitor snake populations is to give them cover. We put out slate, but it could be old pieces of tin, it could be old boards, you know, along the edge of a field on the sunny side, the side that gets the most sun, just a few feet away from the edge. And then we come along and turn up this stuff. These are sandwiches, 2 pieces of slate with a divider in between. We come along, we flip up the top, we see what's there. This is what we found under one of them, this combination of garter snakes and red-bellied snakes. And in that way, we can monitor snakes. There's a friend of mine who has an old truck cap out that he uses for cover. It covered the back of his pickup truck. He has it out, and he was trying to find 5 species of snakes under there at the same time. I'm not sure that he ever got up to 5, but it's that kind of cover that can heat up in the sun, out in the open. The snakes can hide but still get warm, and it's fun to put that out and then check under that cover. Here we're seeing a bunch of garter snakes under one of those pieces of cover. I was just using slate because I live in a part of the state where I can get slate from the slate quarries relatively cheaply. But like I say, it could be metal, it could be plywood. One of the big conservation issues with snakes is roads, more than other creatures, because they may hesitate on the road. Rather than just try to get across the road, they may stop on the road to warm up and to try to soak up the sun. And of course, that's a bad idea. Here's a rat snake, here's a red-bellied. This is a mama garter snake. These are the young that were in her body. Here's another issue, welded plastic mesh. People use it to cover blueberries, other fruit trees, maybe to protect, to keep deer from eating some plants. Here, this is a V-Trans official cutting a milk snake out from, this is erosion control netting. V-Trans now has new regulations where they don't use plastic mesh inside their erosion control mats. They have regular fiber natural fiber mesh that doesn't trap snakes. But plastic mesh, big problem. Right here, we had a whole bunch of water snakes. It was near a water snake den, and they got caught and died. Here we have a bunch of garter snakes that got caught in that habitat. Of the greatest threat that any conservationist will mention to wildlife and to our ecosystems is habitat loss. Second, habitat fragmentation, cutting it up into smaller and smaller pieces. And then the third is the loss of the quality of the habitat degradation. And in Vermont, even though we're a fairly rural state, this is the Five Corners, Essex Five Corners. We develop land at the rate of 75 square miles per decade. And we seem to think that that's necessary for our economy. If it is, and we continue to develop land at that rate, of course, species are going to disappear. Of course, we're going to have more and more flooding. Of course, we're going to have ecosystems that no longer serve the function that they should function. We cannot develop land at that rate indefinitely and still enjoy the natural resources that we have and the life support system that we have. That type of development, we have to learn how to control it, corner it, limit it, and we have to deal with two things that we don't like talking about, but that we really do have to stabilize the human population of the earth. For us to think that we can continue to put more and more people on this planet is crazy. We can't without ruining the planet for us and for others. And it's not a question of telling people how many kids they need to have. It's just a question of giving people the resources and the knowledge and the economic ability to control their own bodies. And if you do, we've seen, like is happening now in Vermont, population will stabilize. And we shouldn't worry about it. We shouldn't be paying people to come to Vermont. It's not something we should worry about. We should celebrate it. Our population is stabilizing. It's a good thing. That means that our rate of development should stabilize as well. Does that mean that we have to figure out how to adjust our economy? Yeah, it does. But it's something we got to deal with. So please report what you see to the Herp Atlas. When you see something cool, you can find us, vtherpatlas.org, and we'd love to hear about what you're seeing. And I'll end on this slide. Take a look at that for a second. You'll figure out what's going on. I am now open to questions for the rest of our time.
All right, we've got 3 questions, Jim.
Yep.
Please identify the egg-laying snakes in Vermont.
Well, okay, let's think of the ones that are smooth skinned. So there's smooth green snake, there's a ringneck snake, there's racer, North American racer, there's milk snake, and who am I forgetting? Rat snake is weakly keeled and does lay eggs. So it's kind of the in-between snake. But I think that's it. Those are the smooth scaled snakes.
Great, thanks for that. And then the next question, do snakes have different lifespans? How old are they when they mate and give birth?
Yeah, they do have different lifespans. Some of the snakes, like some of the rattlesnakes, have been aged at between 40 and 50 years old. Something like a garter snake, or smaller snakes, probably not more than, boy, they'd be lucky to make it 5 or 10 years in the wild. So some of the bigger, heavier bodied snakes can have, and of course in captivity, most people like zoos and natural history places, they may keep a snake there. And that's where the longevity records come from, because those snakes are not living in the wild and they're pampered. And so they live longer in those situations. But we don't have a lot of real data on like the average length of a Lincoln red-bellied snake. We have no data, but it varies a lot.
All right, the next question. Did we used to have copperheads?
We've never had copperheads in Vermont. If somebody was saying copperheads, then they probably were seeing milk snakes. Copperheads are close. Albany, New York. You know, once you get south of like Albany, New York, you'll pick up that species. So it's not super far away, but we have no historic records, no references at all, no proof that they ever made it this far north.
Okay, great, thanks. And then the last question, is there an update on the snake crossing tunnel project for rat snakes on Route 22? And are there ideas for other crossing tunnels?
Well, we've been talking with VTrans for some years about the upgrade that they will be making on Route 22A, and we have recommended some places for snake underpasses, and there's certainly snakes that have been killed there on the road. And so we expect that some underpasses will be built when that project comes to fruition, but VTrans plans those projects years in advance, and the funding, they wait for the right opportunity and the funding to make those projects happen. So sometimes it takes years before those projects are actually built, and I don't know if they're going to be moving forward with that within the next few years or whether that's still further out in the future. I'm not clear on how many years out that particular project is.
Okay, great. I think we're gonna end it there. Someone had a large ringneck snake at their home under the stairs near their walkway, and it scared visitors. Can they be moved or enticed to move away from a populated area?
Well, my general reaction is, you know, we're sharing this planet with other species, and I would prefer that we learn how to share parts of our land with other species. Okay, I'll draw the line when they move into the house, and you know, I understand how you might want to move them out of the house, and then you got to plug the holes around the outside of your house so they can't get back in again. But they really are not at all dangerous, and I would rather teach my friends that it's not a threat than try to move the snake.
Great answer. Thanks, Jim. And I think we're going to end it there. So Jim, thanks so much for another informative and entertaining presentation. For the audience, we plan to host Jim for a couple future programs covering frogs and salamanders to finish his suite of presentations. We bring our programs to the public at no cost, happily, but we do welcome donations. I pasted the link to our donation page into the chat, and half of the donations received in the next few days will be split with Jim's pet project, the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. I pasted the link to that atlas in the chat as well. And we had 100 participants this evening, so it's a real overwhelming display of interest in Jim's presentation and the topic. Thanks to all of you for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here. We look forward to hosting you at a future program. I pasted the link to our programs page into the chat. And with that, I will say thanks again to everybody. And anything to close with, Jim?
We humans own and manage all the land. If wildlife is going to survive into the future, we have to learn how to coexist with it, and we have to, with that wildlife, and we have to learn how to be a good landlord.
Wonderful way, wonderful message to leave us with, Jim. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah. Have a good evening, everybody.